Hello, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at nailing the unseen poetry. So, our objectives for this session are that we are going to understand how to approach an unseen poem with confidence. We are going to learn a step by step method for analysing unseen poetry in exams. And we're going to explore how to identify key poetic techniques and structure a response effectively. So, welcome to today's session where we're going to learn the strategies for tackling unseen poetry in exams, as I said. And by the end of the lesson, you will be equipped with a clear method for approaching unseen poems. You won't be afraid of them anymore, and you'll be able to identify key techniques and structure a strong response. So, the challenge of the unseen, first of all, unseen poetry can be intimidating because you haven't studied it before. Obviously, you studied the skills of unseen poetry, but you won't have seen the poem before. It's not a prepared poem. However, it's simply about applying what you know to a new text. Remember, every poem that you studied from your anthology will have been unseen at one point. So you already know how to analyse poetry, or you should know how to analyse poetry. The key is having a clear step-by-step method for approaching it under exam conditions. So as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, don't be afraid of unseen poetry. See it as an opportunity to showcase your analytical skills and to showcase that insight that you can apply to text and think about the bigger picture. We've talked about a lot in this series, but the bigger picture, the bigger message to society, and the same applies to unseen poetry. And the key to success is staying calm and methodical. So step one, your initial reading. So your first read of the poem should focus on understanding the poem as a whole. And when I say first read, you should be aiming to read the poem 2 to 3 times. And that's really, really important because your first reading of the poem, you're going to understand what it's about, and then we're going to dive deeper into it later on. So don't worry about specific techniques yet. Look, if you spot them, brilliant. You can be thinking about those for your second reading. Your first reading, you just want to understand what is going on because that is going to be the key to unlocking the underlying or hidden message. Focus on the general meaning. Ask yourself, what is the poem about? What emotions or ideas does it convey? And who is the speaker and what is their perspective? The speaker isn't always the poet, so bear that in mind. Is the speaker in the poem a particular character? So think about that when you ask yourself those questions. So as an example, in an unseen poem about nature, your first impression might be that the poet is reflecting on the beauty, or the speaker in the poem might be reflecting on the beauty and power of the natural world, expressing awe or reverence. So kind of like this respect and amazement. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, take a moment after the first reading of the poem to summarize the poem in a single sentence, or just make a couple of notes, because this is going to help you focus on the overall theme or message that it is your job to try and uncover if you're aiming for those top grades. Step 2, now we're going to think about the poetic techniques. And now that you understand the general meaning, go back and look for key poetic techniques in your second reading, which might be more of a skim and scan over the poem, but you should be reading it again at this point. And techniques to look for include imagery, so descriptive language that appeals to the senses. That would include metaphors, similes. Remember, if you forget whether it's a metaphor, simile, personification, you can always refer to it as imagery, as that's kind of an umbrella term. But obviously metaphors and similes, so comparisons that deepen meaning. Remember, they both make comparisons. One uses like or as, the other is a literal, saying that something is something else. Obviously, it's not a literal comparison, it's a metaphorical comparison, but you understand what I mean. It's literally trying to say this is something else, even though it is not. And that comparison between the two identifies and highlights a hidden quality within what it's being compared to. And then personification, so giving human qualities to non-human things, as you know, and the tone, the mood or feeling created by the poem. You can also look at the form and structure, so how the poem is organized, e.g. the stanza length, rhyme scheme. The form is how it is actually laid out on the page. So what form the poet takes. Is it a sonnet? Is it written in blank verse, free verse? Is it written in a set number of lines? So for example, quatrains. And then as an example, in a poem about war, the use of violent imagery, so blood-stained fields, the deafening roar of guns, might create a tone of anger or despair. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, look for patterns in the use of techniques. There is another session on patterns in language, but this is really important because this is a way that you're going to stand out if you're aiming for the top of the mark scheme. If certain images, words, or ideas are repeated, such as creating a semantic field or an extended metaphor, they are likely significant to the poem's theme. And then we're going to think about the analysis. So once you've identified the key techniques, focus on how the language and structure shape the meaning. We're not just feature spotting. So consider, how does the poet's choice of language contribute to the poem's themes? How does the structure, e.g. line breaks, enjambment, rhyme, affect the poem's flow and tone? And as an example, in a poem that uses enjambment, the continuation of a sentence across lines might create a sense of urgency or flow, reflecting the emotions of the speaker. But you need to apply the techniques, whether it's enjambment or whatever it is, apply it to the specific example that you are giving and think about what is the effect in this poem. You can't just have a blanket effect for enjambment. Enjambment does different things at different points in different poems. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, pay attention to the form of the poem. This is often overlooked by students. So is it a sonnet, free verse, or another form? I mentioned that before. But how does the form relate to the content or themes of the poem? So for example, if the poem is written in free verse, and it is about war, you could explain that the free verse form has been selected by the poet to reflect the chaotic and disjointed nature, or the disjointed nature of the poem reflects the chaotic nature of war and the fragmented nature of war. And then step 4, consider intention. So ask yourself, why did the writer write this poem? And you want to be outlining that in your introduction to the unseen poetry, what the poem is about and what message the writer has to wider society. So what message or theme are they trying to convey? Consider the writer's purpose and how they want the readers to respond. So as an example, in a poem about social justice, the poet may be using powerful imagery and emotive language to inspire change or highlight inequality. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, to push your analysis to a higher level, always consider the context. So even if you don't know specific context of the poem, which you're not required to do, think about how it might reflect broader themes like politics, nature, love, or human experience. So kind of think about the bigger picture, the bigger message to society about some of those themes. So when I say context, I don't mean you need to know loads of facts, although this has happened before, if the unseen poem is written by a poet you are familiar with and you know any context, you can put it in there linked to AO2 or AO1 to sort of develop your ideas, but there are no marks for context. So think about the bigger picture is what I mean by context here. And then structuring your response. So once you've analysed your poem, and that seems like a lot of steps, and we're going to be doing that quickly, but I would say spending 5 minutes planning is going to be absolutely essential in the unseen poetry, because it's going to help you craft that conceptualized response and having the thoughts about the poet trying to convey a bigger idea. So once you've analysed the poem, you need to structure response clearly and logically. A typical structure for an unseen poetry essay includes an introduction, so briefly summarize the poem's main theme or message and mention sort of the key ideas that you're going to be discussing or key techniques that you're going to be discussing, and also thinking about, as I said, the message and the big idea, like a hidden idea within the poem, a broader message to society. And then you're going to have your body paragraph. So each paragraph should focus on a different technique or aspect of the poem. So you could focus on the imagery, the tone, the structure, supported by quotations, and thinking about the ideas that are conveyed within the poem. So you want to be kind of, especially for the poetry comparison, you're mainly going to be focusing on the language, but each paragraph should focus on a different aspect of the poem linked to the question using the different methods. And then your conclusion, summarize how the poet conveys their message and the impact of the poem on the reader. You want to be talking about the reader throughout when you're analysing your language, but also the overall impact of the poem linked to the writer's intentions. So as an example, structure. So this poem explores the theme of isolation through its use of bleak imagery and melancholic tone. The poet uses natural metaphors to reflect on the speaker's internal struggle with loneliness. So it's a poem about loneliness, and it's sort of a message within the poem about loneliness. And then at body paragraph 1, you can analyse the language. Body paragraph 2, you might like to analyse the imagery, linking it always to, so your point should always link to the question, but you might want to have a language focus for your body paragraph 1. Body paragraph 2, thinking more about the imagery, which obviously is a language feature, but going more into the imagery and providing more language examples with specific references, whether it's extended metaphors, whether it's personification. And then body paragraph 3, make sure you leave a paragraph to talk about the structural features of the poem. Again, linked to the question. I mean, you can weave this throughout, but identify structural features and ensure you talk about those in your essay. So short fragmented lines to convey emotional detachment could be an example of that. And in your conclusion, you're going to reflect on the overall impact of the poem and its message about the human experience of isolation. Going back to our introduction, if you remember, we talked about the speaker's internal struggle with loneliness. And at the end, we are going to think about the message with regard to human experience of isolation and that broader message to society. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, be sure to include textual evidence. I know you know this, but a lot of you would be surprised at the number of students who just talk about poems in broad terms. So textual evidence in each paragraph and explain how each quotation supports your analysis and contributes to the overall theme of the poem. So linking that back to the overall big idea or theme within the poem. And as an example, in this poem, the speaker reflects on the power of nature using vivid imagery to evoke a sense of awe and reverence. The metaphor of the mighty oak as a symbol of resilience suggests the poet's admiration for nature's strength. The poet's use of enjambment creates a flowing, unbroken rhythm, mirroring the continuity of the natural world. The tone of the poem shifts from admiration to introspection as the speaker realizes their own insignificance in comparison to the vastness of nature. Through these techniques, the poet conveys the theme of human vulnerability in the face of natural forces. And as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, keep your analysis focused. Don't try to cover every single line of the poem. Focus on the most significant techniques and their contribution to the poem's overall meaning. So don't try and talk about everything. In the mark scheme, it talks about judicious selection of evidence. That means well-judged selection of evidence. So start with the things that you're going to have the most to say about. And then some common pitfalls. So over-analyzing. Don't get bogged down in analyzing every single word. I know I just mentioned this, but you don't have to analyze everything. Focus on key techniques that are most relevant to the poem's meaning and to the question. Forgetting to address the theme. Always link your analysis back to the central theme or message of the poem. Ignoring structure. So many students focus too much on language and forget to analyze the structure of the poem. That's why I kind of said to you, think about leaving a whole paragraph to talk about the structure in relation to the question. And then as a grade 8 or grade 9 tip, when analysing unseen poetry, balance your focus of language and structure, because that is what's really going to make you stand out, because most students neglect it. Both are equally important in understanding the poet's intentions and always be linking back to the poet's intentions. And then as just some final thoughts, remember unseen poetry is about applying what you already know to a new text. Stay calm, follow the steps, and focus on the key techniques that shape meaning. Unseen poems can be challenging, but by breaking them down and focusing on key techniques, you can confidently develop a strong response. So try it yourself. Choose an unseen poem from a past paper or any unseen poem, any poem that you've never seen before, and write a 2-paragraph analysis focusing on imagery and structure. So you might want to do one on the imagery utilized within the poem and one on the structure, just to practice looking at those 2 aspects of an unseen poem. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. If you have found it useful, be sure to check out the other free sessions as well as the rest of the resources and lessons on our website. And don't forget to follow us on social media.